They said I'd never recover. My ex-husband promised I'd die alone and forgotten. But when I found an unmarked package containing $85,000 and a cryptic letter, everything changed. What waited for me at the address would expose a conspiracy that destroyed my family and give me the power to fight back. 8 months ago, my life looked almost perfect from the outside. I had a marriage that seemed stable, a career that paid the bills, and friendships I thought would last forever. Today, I'm sitting in a rented room above a laundromat, the smell of detergent seeping through the floorboards, trying to piece together how everything fell apart so spectacularly. My name is Rebecca Torres, and this is the story of how betrayal became the catalyst for the most important fight of my life. Before everything crumbled, I worked as a communications manager at Hartwell & Associates, a mid-sized PR firm in downtown Chicago. The job wasn't glamorous. We handled local campaigns for small businesses, managed social media for neighborhood restaurants, and occasionally landed contracts with dental practices looking to modernize their image. But it paid $52,000 annually, which, combined with my husband Derek's income as a business analyst, gave us a comfortable middle-class existence. We lived in a 2-bedroom condo in Lincoln Park that we'd stretched our budget to afford. The mortgage payments were aggressive, but Derek insisted it was an investment in our future. The neighborhood had tree-lined streets where people walked their dogs and knew each other's names. Our building had a doorman named Luis who always asked about our weekends. It felt safe, predictable, like we were doing everything right. Derek Chen had been my husband for 6 years. We'd met at a charity fundraiser 9 years ago, or at least, that's what I'd always believed. He'd approached me at the silent auction, made a joke about the overpriced wine, and asked intelligent questions about my work that made me feel seen in a way I wasn't used to. He was charming without being pushy, attentive without being overwhelming. Our courtship felt organic. Weekend brunches at neighborhood cafes, evening walks along the lakefront, lazy Sunday mornings reading the newspaper in bed. He proposed after 2 years on a beach in Michigan where we'd gone for a long weekend. I said yes immediately because saying no didn't even occur to me. But things had shifted over the past 18 months. Derek became protective of his devices, angling his laptop away when I walked past his desk. He took phone calls in the hallway of our building, claiming his clients needed privacy. He started working late 3 or 4 nights a week, coming home exhausted and irritable. When I asked if everything was okay, he'd snap about work stress and accuse me of being needy. When I backed off, he complained that I didn't care about his life anymore. I couldn't win, and I stopped trying. Then there was Lauren Mitchell, my best friend since graduate school. We'd been inseparable for over a decade, sharing everything from career frustrations to relationship anxieties. She'd been my maid of honor, standing beside me in a lavender dress we'd spent weeks choosing. She visited our condo every Tuesday evening with takeout and wine, listening to me vent about Derek's distance and assuring me that all marriages went through rough patches. "You're overthinking it," she'd say, refilling my glass. "Derek loves you. He's just stressed about work. Give him space and things will improve." I believed her because questioning your best friend feels like questioning gravity. If you can't trust the person who's known you through every major life transition, who can you trust? My mother, Isabel Torres, had died 4 years earlier in what everyone called a tragic accident. She'd been driving home from work late one evening when her car veered off a rural highway and crashed into a ravine. The police report said she'd likely fallen asleep at the wheel. The road was dangerous, poorly lit, known for accidents. Case closed. My aunt, her older sister Carmen, insisted something wasn't right. Carmen had always been the family outsider, the woman who showed up to holidays with newspaper clippings about corporate malfeasance and warnings about government corruption. At my mother's funeral, she pulled me aside and whispered urgently that Isabel had been investigating something dangerous at Apex Biosystems, the pharmaceutical company where she worked as a senior accountant. "Your mother found discrepancies in their clinical trial data," Carmen had said, gripping my arm. She was preparing to contact federal regulators. "Her death was too convenient, Rebecca. You need to be careful." I dismissed it as grief manifesting as paranoia. Everyone did. Carmen had spent decades being the difficult relative, and we'd all learned to nod politely and change the subject. When Carmen died 7 months ago alone in her cluttered house, surrounded by filing cabinets and conspiracy theories, I felt guilty for not visiting more, for not taking her seriously, for writing her off as unstable when maybe she just saw patterns the rest of us were too comfortable to acknowledge. But I had my own problems. Derek's emotional distance had evolved into something harder to ignore. He'd stopped touching me casually, no hand on my back when we walked, no kiss goodbye in the morning. Sex had become infrequent and perfunctory, like he was fulfilling an obligation rather than expressing desire. I convinced myself we just needed to reconnect. We scheduled a vacation we couldn't afford, tried date nights that felt forced, attended a marriage counseling session that Derek dominated with complaints about my communication style. Nothing helped because the problem wasn't what I thought it was. But before I reveal what shattered my entire world, let me ask you this. Have you ever noticed the small signs that something's wrong, but talked yourself out of believing your own instincts? Stay with me, because what I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about my life. Asterisk, asterisk. The unraveling began on a Thursday afternoon in early February. I'd been at work reviewing a social media calendar for a family-owned bakery when nausea hit me like a physical blow. Not the flu, not food poisoning, something deeper. A wrongness that settled in my chest and made breathing difficult. I told my supervisor, Margaret, that I needed to go home. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher and said, "Of course, feel better," in a tone that made my skin crawl. Like she was relieved I was leaving. Like she knew something I didn't. The drive home took 30 minutes through afternoon traffic. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. I told myself I was being irrational, that I probably had a stomach bug, that anxiety was amplifying normal symptoms into something ominous. When I pulled into our building's parking garage, I saw Lauren's car in a visitor spot. Her silver Mazda that I'd been a passenger in hundreds of times. She had a key to our condo and sometimes stopped by during the day if she needed to work somewhere with better Wi-Fi than her apartment offered. It shouldn't have been strange. But on a Thursday afternoon when Derek was supposed to be at his office downtown and Lauren was supposed to be at her marketing job, something about it felt wrong. I sat in my car with the engine running, cycling through innocent explanations. Maybe Derek had come home sick. Maybe Lauren was dropping something off. Maybe they were planning a surprise for my upcoming birthday. I finally turned off the engine and walked to the elevator, rode up to the 14th floor, walked down the carpeted hallway to our door. I used my key quietly, though I couldn't have explained why stealth felt necessary. The condo was silent in that occupied way where you sense people are present even when you can't hear them. I stood in the entryway, my work bag still over my shoulder, listening. That's when I heard laughter from our bedroom. Lauren's laughter, but not her normal laugh, the intimate kind that's designed for someone specific. I stood frozen, my brain working overtime to construct explanations that would preserve the reality I thought I inhabited. Maybe she was on a video call. Maybe Derek wasn't even home. Maybe I was misunderstanding everything because I already felt sick and paranoid. But I knew. Somewhere beneath the desperate rationalizations, I already knew what I'd find when I opened that door. I crossed the living room, each step taking forever. I didn't knock. Why would I knock on my own bedroom door? I just turned the handle and pushed. Derek and Lauren were in my bed, tangled in the navy sheets I'd changed 3 days earlier. They looked at each other with familiar intimacy. This wasn't new for them. This was routine. When they saw me standing there, the first expression on Lauren's face wasn't shame. It was irritation. Like I was the one being inappropriate by interrupting. She didn't scramble to cover herself. She didn't apologize. She just looked at me with an expression that said, "Why are you making this dramatic?" Derek got out of bed and pulled on his jeans with practiced efficiency that told me this wasn't the first time he'd dressed quickly in an awkward situation. This realization hit harder than catching them together. This wasn't a mistake. This was something they'd done enough times that the mechanics had become automatic. He looked at me with impatience mixed with relief. Like this confrontation was inconvenient, but also something he'd been waiting for because pretending had gotten tiresome. "Becca," he said in that calm voice he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. "Let's talk about this rationally." The audacity of that statement almost made me laugh. It was exactly what it looked like, but he stood there trying to gaslight me into questioning my own eyes. Lauren sat up, holding the sheet with false modesty that would have been funny if it wasn't so insulting. "We didn't want you to find out this way," she said with something close to pity. "But honestly, Becca, this has been coming for a while. You had to know things weren't working between you two." The presumption stole my breath. Not just that she'd been sleeping with Derek, but that she thought I should have known. That this was somehow my fault for not noticing sooner. "How long?" My voice sounded detached, like I was asking about something that didn't matter. Derek answered emotionlessly. "Does it matter? Long enough that we're sure about this." That word, sure cut deeper than anything else. How long had every kiss been performance? How long had every "I love you" been a lie? And how long had Lauren been sitting on my couch every Tuesday night, drinking my wine, listening to me talk about my marriage problems while she was sleeping with my husband the rest of the week? I didn't scream. I didn't throw things. I just turned around, walked to the guest bedroom, and started packing clothes into a suitcase. Practical things you need when your life implodes: laptop, chargers, toiletries, documents. Derek followed me, still shirtless, still trying to have a rational conversation, like this was a reasonable situation that could be resolved through calm discussion. I left without saying another word. Walked out of the condo I'd helped pay for, drove to a coffee shop parking lot 5 miles away, and sat in my car crying until I couldn't breathe properly. Then I called my cousin Maria and asked if I could stay with her while I figured out what to do next. What I didn't know then was that this betrayal was just the surface. The real conspiracy went deeper than infidelity, connecting to my mother's death and a web of corporate fraud that would take years to untangle. But first, I had to survive what came next. I stayed on Maria's couch for exactly 1 week before everything accelerated. My cousin was generous. She gave me the guest bedroom, told me to take whatever time I needed, made extra coffee in the mornings. But I could feel the situation's expiration date approaching. Her partner, James, kept making comments about me needing to get back on my feet and move forward with my life. On the 8th day, my phone rang. Margaret, my supervisor at Hartwell & Associates, asked me to come to the office first thing Monday morning. Her voice had that careful quality people use when delivering bad news they want to seem compassionate about. I showed up at 8:30 a.m. wearing clothes I'd borrowed from Maria because I hadn't been back to the condo to get more of my wardrobe. I wanted to look professional despite feeling like I was barely keeping myself together. Margaret's office door was open. She gestured to the chair across from her desk with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been relief that this conversation was finally happening. "Rebecca," she began, shuffling papers without meeting my eyes. "We're restructuring the communications department due to budget constraints. Unfortunately, your position is being eliminated. We're offering a severance package to help with the transition." She slid a folder across her desk. I didn't touch it immediately. I just stared at her, trying to process what she was saying while my brain screamed that this couldn't be happening. Not now. Not when everything else was already destroyed. "Budget constraints?" I repeated, hearing my voice sound hollow. "We just signed 4 new clients last quarter. I've seen the financial reports. We're not struggling." Margaret's expression didn't change. "These decisions are made above my level, Rebecca. I'm sorry, but it's final." I wanted to ask if this had anything to do with Derek, if word had gotten around about the separation, and I'd become too much of a liability. But something in her face stopped me, a flicker of discomfort that suggested asking questions wouldn't change anything. I took the folder, packed my desk in 20 minutes, while my coworkers suddenly became very interested in their computer screens, and walked out of Hartwell & Associates with a cardboard box containing 4 years of work and a severance package that barely covered 2 months of rent. Later, much later, I discovered that Margaret's husband had gone to business school with Derek. That my job had never been as secure as I'd believed. That it had always been conditional on remaining useful to people whose agendas I didn't understand. But that Monday morning, sitting in my car in the parking lot, I just felt the ground shift beneath me again. The divorce proceedings started 3 weeks after I lost my job. Derek hired Catherine Brennan, an attorney known for winning cases through procedural aggression. My attorney was court-appointed, an exhausted man named Paul Rao who seemed to have given up on believing in justice years ago. Catherine filed motions painting me as unstable and irresponsible. She used my job loss as evidence of inability to function as an adult. She pointed to my temporary housing situation, crashing with my cousin, as proof I couldn't manage my own life. Every detail of my current circumstances became ammunition in a legal strategy designed to justify why Derek deserved everything while I deserved nothing. The judge was Thomas Harrington, a man in his 60s who moved through his docket with efficiency that suggested he'd made decisions before hearing testimony. Every motion Catherine filed, Judge Harrington approved. Every request Paul made on my behalf, the judge denied with barely a glance. Derek kept our condo because his name was listed first on the mortgage, even though I'd contributed equally. He kept our car because I'd missed one payment during the chaos following my job loss. He kept the furniture, the savings account, the retirement funds. The settlement left me with my clothing, my laptop, and barely enough money to cover 2 months of rent anywhere I could afford. The worst part wasn't losing the possessions. It was watching Lauren take the stand as a character witness against me. She wore a charcoal suit I recognized immediately. We'd bought matching ones 2 years earlier during a shopping trip. She'd asked my opinion, and I'd told her it made her look confident and powerful. Now she was using that confidence to destroy me in court. She sat in the witness stand with perfect posture and lied with conviction that comes from practice. She told Judge Harrington that I'd been unstable for months, that I'd made concerning comments about self-harm, that I'd become increasingly paranoid and difficult to be around. None of it was true. But Lauren delivered each lie with perfect emotional calibration, her voice breaking at the right moments, her expression showing reluctant concern. When Paul tried to cross-examine her about her relationship with Derek, Catherine objected before he could finish the question. Judge Harrington sustained it immediately. I sat at the defendant's table watching my best friend of 12 years systematically destroy my credibility, and I understood this had been coordinated. The affair, the job loss, the divorce proceedings, all timed and executed with precision that went beyond coincidence. After the divorce finalized, Maria let me stay another 3 weeks before James started making pointed comments about boundaries and personal space. I heard him talking to Maria through their bedroom wall at night. She can't stay here indefinitely. You're enabling her by letting her avoid dealing with her situation. Maria defended me in a tired voice that suggested she was running out of arguments. I started looking for anywhere else to go before she had to ask me to leave. Friends offered their couches temporarily. One let me stay for 6 days before deciding my presence brought negative energy. Another remembered she had family visiting and needed the guest room. A former colleague from Hartwell gave me 10 days before her roommate complained about having a stranger in their apartment. Everyone was sympathetic right up until sympathy became inconvenient, right up until supporting me required sustained sacrifice rather than kind words. When I finally scraped together enough money from sporadic freelance work, managing social media for a yoga studio, writing blog posts for a pet grooming business, I paid for a weekly rate at the Riverside Motel off Highway 94. The woman at the front desk had a name tag that said Gloria and an expression suggesting she'd witnessed this exact scenario thousands of times. Women alone with suitcases and desperate eyes, paying weekly rates while pretending this was temporary. She didn't ask questions. She just took my cash, handed me a key attached to a faded red plastic tag marked with the number 22, and recited rules in a flat voice. Room 22 became my address, my home, the place where I'd eventually discover something that would change everything. Asterisk, I thought I'd hit rock bottom. I thought there was nothing left to lose. But hidden beneath the bed in that depressing motel room was evidence that would reveal the truth about my mother's death and give me the resources to fight back. What I found would expose a conspiracy that destroyed my family and dozens of others. Asterisk. Room 22 at the Riverside Motel smelled like decades of cigarette smoke layered underneath industrial cleaner, 2 cents fighting a war neither could win. The carpet was brown to hide stains, The bed sagged in the middle, and the television was from an era when flat screens were still luxury items. This was home now. This was what systematic betrayal looked like. I tried to establish routine to prevent complete psychological collapse. Wake early, make instant coffee with the aging machine, spend mornings applying for jobs online. Nobody called back. Nobody even sent rejection emails. Afternoons were for freelance work, whatever small projects I could find that paid enough to cover weekly motel rent with a little leftover for food. Dinner was usually instant ramen or canned soup heated in the microwave. I'd been living there for 5 weeks when I found the package. It was late afternoon, overcast skies making the room darker than usual. I dropped my phone charger, and it rolled under the bed. I got on my hands and knees to retrieve it, reaching into the dusty space between the bed and floor. My hand hit something that shouldn't have been there, something solid and rectangular. Your mother discovered that Apex was falsifying clinical trial data for profitable drugs. She was about to expose them when they killed her and made it look like an accident. I've spent 4 years collecting proof. Everything you need is waiting at the address I've written down. The money is just for travel. The real fortune, the real weapon, is in Seattle. You have a choice. Take the money and disappear, or use it to fight. Your mother would understand either decision. But I know which one lets you sleep at night. Finish what Isabel started. With love and Carmen. I read the note 3 times, each reading making the words feel simultaneously more impossible and more true. Derek and Lauren working for Apex. My mother murdered for discovering fraud. Carmen collecting evidence while everyone called her paranoid. I turned the combination lock with shaking hands. 1-9-7-4. It clicked open. Inside the box was money, $85,000 in cash, mostly $100 bills bundled with rubber bands. The bills smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Underneath the money was a plane ticket printed on paper that had started to yellow slightly, Seattle, Washington. Departure date, 6 days from now. And underneath the ticket was a USB drive wrapped in bubble wrap, with a sticky note attached, *, watch this first. Then decide. I spent that night sitting on the sagging motel bed with the metal box open beside me, unable to sleep, unable to think about anything except the choice Carmen was forcing me to make. By morning, I'd decided. I wasn't running. I was done being the person things happened to. I packed my few belongings into a duffel bag, clothes, laptop, toiletries, the $85,000 wrapped in a waterproof bag. I left a note for Gloria saying I'd paid through the week but wouldn't be returning. She looked at me when I dropped off the key with an expression that might have been concern or relief. Good luck, she said, which could have meant anything. The flight to Seattle left on a Wednesday morning from O'Hare. I'd booked it using Carmen's cash. Spent the entire drive to the airport trying not to think about the insanity of what I was doing, flying across the country to follow instructions from a dead aunt everyone had called paranoid, chasing a conspiracy theory connecting my husband's affair to my mother's death 4 years ago. When I said it like that, it sounded crazy. But Carmen's note was in my bag, the money was real, and the plane ticket had my name on it. The airline was a budget carrier that charged extra for everything. I paid $20 to bring a duffel bag, then spent 4 hours wedged between a businessman who monopolized both armrests and a teenager who watched videos on his phone without headphones. I didn't sleep. My mind wouldn't stop cycling through impossible questions. What had my mother discovered? How deep did Derek and Lauren's involvement go? Had any part of my marriage been real? The businessman kept glancing at the duffel bag I held on my lap, probably wondering why I clutched it like it contained something irreplaceable. I wanted to tell him it contained $85,000 and possibly the key to understanding why my life had been systematically dismantled. But I just stared out the window at darkness punctuated by scattered lights below, cities full of people whose lives probably made sense to them in ways mine no longer did. What waited for me in Seattle would change everything. Carmen had spent her final years building a case that could bring down a pharmaceutical empire, and she'd left me with the evidence and resources to finish what my mother started. But first, I had to face the truth about how deep the conspiracy really went. Seattle greeted me with rain that felt different from Chicago rain, heavier, colder, the kind that seeps through clothing and settles into bones. I rented a car using Carmen's cash and a credit card I'd been avoiding because it was probably near its limit. The rental agent barely looked at me, just processed the paperwork with mechanical efficiency. Carmen's note had directed me to an address in Ballard, a neighborhood of older homes and quiet streets where houses maintained polite distance from their neighbors. The GPS guided me through tree-lined avenues until I reached a small craftsman-style house at the end of a residential block. The windows were dark, the lawn overgrown with grass that reached heights suggesting nobody had mowed it in months. The driveway had cracks with weeds pushing through the pavement. It screamed, "Someone died here and nobody knows what to do with it." I parked in the driveway and sat with the engine running, trying to decide if I was actually brave enough to go through with this. Carmen's note said the truth was here. But what if the truth was worse than the lies? I turned off the engine and got out before I could talk myself out of it. The front door was locked, but Carmen had left a key in the metal box, taped inside a small envelope marked "House." I let myself in, stepping into air that smelled stale and undisturbed, the particular smell of a place where nobody had opened a window or lived an actual life in months. The interior matched family descriptions of Carmen's living situation: books everywhere, filing cabinets in the living room, papers organized in labeled boxes. The kitchen looked barely used, just a coffee maker and microwave. But the note had directed me to the basement, not the house itself. I found the door off the kitchen and flipped the light switch. Fluorescent bulbs flickered on, illuminating wooden stairs descending into darkness. I went down slowly, gripping the railing, and reached a finished basement that had been converted into something between an office and an evidence room. Filing cabinets lined one wall, each drawer labeled with years spanning from 2015 to this year. Boxes were stacked along another wall, indexed with professional precision. A desk held an older laptop, a document scanner, and what looked like audio recording equipment. But what dominated the space was a large bulletin board covering most of the back wall. It was covered with photographs, documents, and connecting strings of different colors, the kind of visual you see in detective movies when investigators are tracking complex conspiracies. I stepped closer, my eyes adjusting to take in the sheer amount of information Carmen had assembled. In the center of the board was a photograph of my mother, Isabel Torres, standing next to a man I didn't recognize in what appeared to be a corporate setting. Both wore business attire and name tags. The banner behind them read, "Apex Biosystems Annual Conference 2016. Connected to this central photo by red string were dozens of other images and documents. Derek Chen and Lauren Mitchell at the same conference, wearing name tags identifying them as consultants. Financial records showing payments from Apex to shell companies. Email printouts with damning subject lines like Torres investigation status and containment protocols. My hands started shaking as I moved along the board, following the strings connecting everything. There were photographs of Derek and my mother together at Apex, multiple occasions spanning 3 years before I'd supposedly met him by chance at that charity fundraiser. Lauren appeared in several photos with a woman labeled Dr. Patricia Ewan, Apex senior researcher. Bank statements showed regular deposits into Derek's accounts from entities linked to Apex Biosystems, including payments dated throughout our entire marriage. And then I saw the cluster of documents Carmen had marked with red sticky notes, police reports from my mother's accident, investigative notes questioning the official findings, photographs of the crash site showing details that didn't match the police narrative. I found the laptop on the desk and opened it. The desktop was organized with folders labeled by topic: clinical trial fraud, financial records, surveillance evidence, Isabel's investigation, Rebecca's infiltration. That last folder name made my stomach drop. I clicked it open. Inside were dozens of documents tracking my relationship with Derek from before we'd even met, surveillance photos of me from 9 years ago, personality assessments, vulnerability analyses, strategy memos discussing how to establish contact and build trust. There was a file labeled Derek_Rebecca_strategy.pdf. I opened it with trembling hands. It was a 47-page document outlining a plan to position Derek Chen in my life as a romantic partner, specifically to monitor my mother's activities and prevent me from becoming involved in her investigation. The document was clinical, disturbing in its detail. Target: Rebecca Torres, daughter of Isabel Torres, Apex senior accountant, current investigation subject. Objective: establish long-term romantic relationship to facilitate monitoring of Isabel Torres's activities and prevent Rebecca from becoming aware of or involved in her mother's investigation. Method: engineer chance meeting at charity event. See attached venue details and guest list. Build rapport through shared interests. See personality profile. Propose marriage within 18 to 24 months to establish permanent surveillance position within target's family unit. Timeline: maintain relationship indefinitely. Primary objective is isolation of investigation subject, Isabel, from her daughter, Rebecca. Secondary objective is acquisition of any information Rebecca may inadvertently possess regarding her mother's findings. I couldn't breathe properly. Every moment of intimacy, every declaration of love, every promise about our future, all of it had been calculated manipulation documented in cold, clinical language. I'd been a surveillance target before I'd been a girlfriend. A mark before I'd been a wife. I found the USB drive Carmen had left in the metal box and plugged it into the laptop. A single video file appeared, labeled watch_this_first.mp4. I double-clicked it, and Carmen's face filled the screen. She looked exactly as I remembered from the last time I'd seen her at my mother's funeral 4 years ago, though visibly worn down by illness. She wore her favorite navy cardigan, the one she'd worn to every family gathering. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the camera, but her eyes were sharp and focused. "Rebecca," she began, her voice steady despite visible physical deterioration. "If you're watching this, I'm dead and you found my evidence, which means you're probably angry, confused, and wondering why I didn't tell you any of this while I was alive." She paused to take a sip from a water bottle just off camera. "The answer is simple. I tried. I warned you about Derek before you married him. I pulled you aside at your engagement party and told you something felt wrong about him. I told you to watch how Lauren behaved around him, to pay attention to inconsistencies in his story about how you met. You thought I was being paranoid, seeing conspiracies where there were none. You told me I needed to let you live your own life without interference." Carmen's expression softened. "I don't blame you for that. I'd spent decades being the family member everyone described as difficult and unstable. The one who handed out pamphlets about corporate malfeasance at Thanksgiving. The one who warned about trusting people with perfect explanations. By the time I tried to warn you about Derek, you'd already learned to dismiss everything I said." She leaned forward slightly. "Your mother, Isabel, was my best friend long before she was your mother. When she discovered what Apex Biosystems was doing, falsifying clinical trial data to get dangerous drugs approved, bribing FDA officials, silencing whistleblowers, she came to me first because she knew I'd help her document everything properly." Carmen coughed, covering her mouth with a tissue. When she pulled it away, I could see blood on the white fabric. "We spent months building a case, collecting evidence, preparing to go to federal authorities. Then she died in that convenient accident, and I knew exactly what had happened even though I couldn't prove it yet. I've spent the last 4 years collecting the evidence you're surrounded by right now. Every document, every recording, every financial trail." She looked directly at the camera with intensity that made it feel like she was in the room with me. "You have 2 choices, Rebecca, just like your mother had before they killed her. You can take the money I left and disappear. Change your identity, move somewhere far away, live comfortably and safely, never look back. Nobody would blame you for choosing survival over justice. You've already lost so much. You deserve peace if that's what you want." Carmen paused, her expression becoming more serious. "Or you can fight. You can use everything I've collected and destroy the people who murdered your mother and dismantled your life. It won't be easy. They have money, lawyers, political connections. You'll be threatened, harassed, possibly endangered. But Rebecca, if you fight, you might actually win. And even if you don't win completely, you'll make them pay a price for what they did." She smiled then, that crooked smile I remembered from childhood when she'd sneak me extra cookies or let me stay up reading in her library. "Either way, you'll have a story worth telling. Your mother would be proud of you regardless of what you choose. But I think we both know which choice lets you sleep at night. Carmen reached for something off camera, then looked back at the screen. Oh, and there's one more thing. Cascade Community Bank, account number 8847. Password is your mother's employee number from Apex, IS 20-4479. That's the real fortune. The $85,000 is just travel money. Use what's in that account to fight or use it to run. But for God's sake, use it. The video ended with Carmen reaching toward the camera, and then the screen went black. I sat in the silence of her basement evidence room for a long time before pulling out my phone and searching for Cascade Community Bank's customer service number. The call to Cascade Community Bank took nearly an hour of navigating automated systems before I reached a human being. I gave them the account number Carmen had mentioned, and the representative went silent for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Miss Torres," she said finally, her voice suddenly much more formal. "I'm going to transfer you to our private wealth management division. Please hold." The hold music was smooth jazz that sounded tinny through my phone speaker. After what felt like forever, a man named Robert came on the line and asked me to verify my identity using my mother's employee number as the password. When I recited the numbers, he paused before speaking in careful, measured language. "Ms. Torres, your Aunt Carmen established an irrevocable trust in your name approximately 3 years ago. The trust contains diversified investment portfolios, commercial real estate holdings, and intellectual property assets that your mother secured before her death. The current value is approximately $18.3 million, structured to protect it from legal challenges and ensure that only you can access it." $18.3 million. The words didn't sound real. They sounded like dialogue from someone else's life, not mine. I was sitting in a dead woman's basement surrounded by evidence of conspiracy and murder, and now being told I had access to more money than I could comprehend. Carmen had spent 4 years not just collecting evidence, but building a financial fortress that would allow me to fight without being destroyed by legal fees and endless court battles. She'd wrapped justice like a gift and left it with enough resources to actually achieve it. I chose to fight. Using the contact information Carmen had left in her files, I called Special Agent Marcus Webb at the FBI's Seattle field office. He answered on the second ring with a tone suggesting he was busy and skeptical about whatever I was calling about. "This is Webb. My name is Rebecca Torres," I said, hearing my voice shake slightly. "My Aunt Carmen Vaughn left me evidence about Apex Biosystems, clinical trial fraud, bribery, possibly murder. I think you've been trying to build a case against them." The silence lasted long enough that I checked my phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Where are you right now?" Marcus asked, his tone completely changed, urgent, focused. "Ballard. At my aunt's property. Don't leave. Don't touch anything else. Don't talk to anyone about this. I'm coming to you. I'll be there in 25 minutes. He hung up before I could respond. Marcus arrived in 22 minutes, which suggested he'd driven faster than was legal. He was in his early 50s with gray hair and tired eyes, wearing dark jeans and a FBI jacket. He looked at me standing in Carmen's driveway with an expression that was equal parts skepticism and barely contained hope. "Show me," he said simply. I led him inside, down to the basement, and watched his face change as he took in the filing cabinets, the bulletin board, the organized documentation of 4 years of investigation. He put on latex gloves before touching anything, pulling out files and reading with an intensity that made me understand why Carmen had trusted him with her initial findings years ago. "Your aunt was either the most meticulous investigator I've ever encountered or she was brilliant," Marcus said after examining the evidence for 40 minutes. "Probably both. This is enough to open a federal investigation. We're talking conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery of federal officials, potentially murder charges if we can prove your mother's accident was arranged." He looked at me directly. "Rebecca, you just handed me a case that could take down a major pharmaceutical company and potentially expose corruption in FDA approval processes. This is significant. But getting justice wouldn't be quick or easy. What followed was 18 months of investigation, legal battles, and threats from people who had billions of dollars to lose. The fight would test everything I had, but Carmen had given me the resources and evidence to win. And I was done being a victim. The investigation that followed moved with bureaucratic slowness that Marcus assured me was necessary when building cases against corporations with unlimited resources and armies of lawyers. Subpoenas had to be drafted, reviewed, and approved. Bank records needed freezing, which required warrants based on probable cause. Former Apex employees who'd been fired or forced out had to be interviewed. The pharmaceutical industry's underground network of whistleblowers slowly emerged, sharing their own stories of retaliation and fraud. Marcus helped me find a small apartment in Capitol Hill, a one-bedroom in an older building with hardwood floors that creaked and windows overlooking a neighborhood coffee shop. It was infinitely better than room 22 at the Riverside Motel, but I kept it modest because I didn't want to feel like I was spending resources that should be reserved for the legal battle ahead. I used money from Carmen's trust to pay rent and living expenses, living simply while the investigation churned forward with agonizing slowness. I met with federal prosecutors every few weeks. They had endless questions about every piece of evidence Carmen had collected, asking me to explain timelines and relationships and conversations I'd overheard during my marriage that I hadn't understood were significant at the time. They wanted to know about Derek's schedule, about Lauren's visits, about my mother's behavior in the months before she died. I answered everything as thoroughly as I could, watching them take notes and exchange meaningful glances that suggested they were building something substantial. Marcus called periodically with updates that mostly consisted of "we're making progress" and "don't discuss this with anyone," what federal agents say when they can't share details but want you to know you haven't been forgotten. The waiting was excruciating. I'd handed over everything Carmen had collected, and now I was just existing in limbo, hoping that the machinery of justice would actually work instead of grinding me up and spitting me out. Then, 14 months after I'd first walked into Carmen's basement, things started happening with the kind of speed that suggested the government had finally accumulated enough evidence to move confidently. It began on a Tuesday morning in late April. Apex Biosystems headquarters, a gleaming glass tower in downtown Seattle, got raided by federal agents who carried boxes out while news cameras captured everything. The images made national news. Employees standing in the parking lot looking shocked while agents in FBI windbreakers methodically dismantled what had seemed like an untouchable empire. Dr. Jonathan Reeves, the CEO whose signature appeared on dozens of fraudulent approval documents in Carmen's evidence, was arrested at his waterfront estate. News cameras caught footage of him being led out in handcuffs past his neighbors and reporters shouting questions he refused to answer. Marcus called me that afternoon. Derek Chen was arrested this morning at his workplace. Lauren Mitchell was arrested at her apartment. We're executing arrest warrants for 17 additional individuals connected to the conspiracy. I watched the footage on the local news that evening, rewinding it multiple times. Derek maintained his composure, didn't speak to reporters, walked with his head up like he was enduring a minor inconvenience rather than being arrested for conspiracy to commit murder and fraud. But I could see something in his eyes that looked like fear mixed with disbelief, like he genuinely thought he was untouchable and was only now realizing how catastrophically wrong he'd been. Lauren was arrested at a coffee shop where she'd been meeting a client for her freelance marketing business. The news showed her crying during the arrest, tears that felt performative given that she'd testified against me in divorce court without showing genuine emotion. Her attorney issued a statement claiming she'd been manipulated by Derek and had no knowledge of the conspiracy's full extent. But I'd seen the evidence, payments made specifically to maintain our friendship as surveillance, email exchanges discussing how to keep me isolated and manageable after my mother's death. Lauren hadn't been a victim. She'd been a willing participant who'd weaponized our friendship. Then came the revelation about Judge Thomas Harrington. He resigned from the bench with a statement about pursuing other opportunities, what corrupt officials say when they're hoping resignation will prevent prosecution. It didn't work. He was indicted 4 weeks later for accepting bribes and manipulating court proceedings. Documents Carmen had collected showed he'd purchased property through trusts that traced back to Apex, that he'd been ruling in favor of corporate interests for years in exchange for payments disguised as consulting fees. Every case he'd presided over in the past 8 years was reviewed for potential corruption. My divorce case was among the first flagged for immediate review. A new judge took 20 minutes to determine that the original ruling had been based on fabricated testimony and biased proceedings. Everything Harrington had decided was vacated, erased like it had never happened. Marcus called me when the review was completed. Your marriage to Derek Chen is being annulled rather than finalized as a divorce. The court is declaring it invalid from the beginning due to fraud. You're also getting a formal apology from the judicial system for what happened. It was worth something. Not enough to undo the damage or erase the months of suffering, but something. The formal apology arrived as a letter on official court stationery signed by 3 judges. It acknowledged that I'd been subjected to proceedings fundamentally compromised by corruption and fabricated testimony. It expressed regret for the harm caused by a system that had failed to protect me. It was 2 pages of careful legal language trying to convey remorse without admitting liability that might open the courts to lawsuits. I read it once and filed it away with all the other documents marking the destruction and slow rebuilding of my life. The trials would take years. Derek, Lauren, and dozens of others would face justice for what they'd done. But watching them fall wasn't the ending I needed. I needed to build something meaningful from the ruins, something that would honor my mother and Carmen, something that would prevent this from happening to others. And I finally had the resources to do it. The trials began 8 months after the arrests and stretched across nearly 2 years. Marcus had warned me that cases this complex moved slowly, that building prosecutions against multiple defendants with interconnected criminal activity required patience and meticulous attention to procedural detail. Dr. Jonathan Reeves went to trial first. His case became a media spectacle dominating news cycles for weeks. Pharmaceutical industry whistleblowers testified about Apex's culture of fraud, describing how executives incentivized researchers to manipulate clinical trial data and how safety concerns were systematically buried when they threatened profitable drug approvals. Patients who'd been harmed by medications that should never have reached the market shared devastating stories. A father whose son had died from complications related to a drug Apex had pushed through with falsified safety data spoke for 30 minutes about watching his child suffer. Forensic accountants explained money trails connecting executive bonuses directly to fraudulent approvals, showing how Jonathan Reeves had personally profited from every dangerous medication the company brought to market. The jury deliberated for 9 days. When they returned with guilty verdicts on 23 counts, including fraud, conspiracy, bribery, and reckless endangerment, Jonathan Reeves showed no visible emotion. He stood while the judge read the sentence, 28 years in federal prison and forfeiture of approximately $63 million in assets. He was 64 years old, which meant he'd likely spend the rest of his life incarcerated. I watched the sentencing from the gallery, sitting in the back row where I could observe without being noticed. When the bailiffs led Jonathan Reeves away in handcuffs, I felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite closure. It was more like watching a complex equation finally balance, all the variables falling into their proper places after years of deliberate miscalculation. Derek's trial was smaller, quieter, without the media attention that had surrounded Reeves. But it was more personal for me. I attended every day of the proceedings, sitting in the same seat, watching prosecutors present evidence of his role in monitoring my mother, his participation in planning her murder, his 7-year marriage to me as an intelligence-gathering operation. The recordings Carmen had collected were played in court. I listened to Derek's voice discussing my mother like she was an obstacle that needed removing, heard him strategize about how to use our relationship for information access, heard him report on intimate details of our life together like he was filing surveillance reports, which, essentially, he had been. Prosecutors presented bank records showing payments made to him throughout our entire marriage, demonstrating that he'd been compensated for every month he'd spent pretending to love me. His defense attorney tried to argue that Derek had been a low-level participant coerced by more powerful people, that he'd been manipulated into involvement he hadn't fully understood. But the evidence showed someone enthusiastic and willing, someone who'd made strategic suggestions about approaching my mother's murder, who'd continued receiving payments and participating years after her death. The jury returned guilty verdicts on conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and racketeering. The judge sentenced him to 18 years in federal prison. When the verdict was read, Derek looked across the courtroom directly at me. His expression was complicated, something between anger and resignation, like he couldn't quite believe the woman he'd married as part of a surveillance operation had been the one to bring evidence that destroyed him. I looked back without blinking, without emotion, because I was done being intimidated by people who'd systematically underestimated what I was capable of when pushed far enough. Lauren accepted a plea deal rather than going to trial. In exchange for testimony against other defendants, her sentence was reduced to 10 years. She provided information about Dr. Patricia Ewan and other Apex employees who'd been part of the conspiracy, helping prosecutors build cases against people who might otherwise have escaped accountability. 7 months after her sentencing, I received a letter from her, 4 pages written on prison stationery, full of apologies and explanations about how she'd been young and financially desperate when Apex first approached her, how she'd made terrible choices she regretted every day, how being assigned to befriend me had started as just a job but had become complicated when she'd actually grown to care about me. She asked if we could eventually find a way toward forgiveness, because our friendship had meant something real even though it was built on deception. I read the letter once while drinking morning coffee in my Seattle apartment, and I felt nothing but hollow satisfaction. The letter was self-justification dressed in the language of remorse, trying to rewrite history so Lauren could see herself as a victim of circumstances rather than an active participant in destroying another person's life. She wanted absolution I wasn't willing to give. I filed the letter away and never responded. Some relationships can't be repaired and shouldn't be attempted. Forgiveness isn't something you owe to people who systematically destroyed your life just because they later regret getting caught. The civil lawsuit against Apex Biosystems took another 18 months to resolve. The company fought aggressively, deploying teams of lawyers to challenge every claim and drag out proceedings as long as possible. But eventually, facing the weight of evidence that had already resulted in criminal convictions for their executives, they settled. The terms required Apex to pay $3.4 billion to patients harmed by their fraudulent drug approvals. They had to fund independent safety reviews of every medication they'd brought to market in the past 12 years. They were placed under federal monitoring for 20 years, with regulators embedded in their approval processes. My mother's estate received $16 million in wrongful death damages. I inherited it as her only living relative, and I donated every dollar to organizations advocating for pharmaceutical safety and transparency. The money felt tainted earned through my mother's murder, and I already had enough resources from Carmen's trust to live comfortably without it. I used a significant portion of Carmen's trust to establish the Torresbon Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to investigating pharmaceutical fraud and supporting whistleblowers who risk their careers to expose corporate misconduct. We hired investigators to track down evidence of safety violations. We funded legal defenses for employees facing retaliation after reporting problems. We published reports that made pharmaceutical companies deeply uncomfortable, shining light into corners where they preferred darkness. The foundation became my full-time work, my way of channeling grief and anger into something productive, something that would have made my mother and Carmen proud. Something that turned their deaths into a legacy that actually helped people instead of just being tragic endings to lives cut short by greed. We helped expose 3 additional pharmaceutical companies engaged in clinical trial fraud. We supported 17 whistleblowers facing legal retaliation from their former employers. We funded safety reviews that led to 4 dangerous medications being pulled from the market before they could cause widespread harm. I hired Maria Torres-Webb, Marcus's partner who'd been the FBI agent who first helped me navigate the federal investigation system. She became the Foundation's Director of Investigations, bringing her expertise and connections to our mission. I hired Paul Rao, the exhausted court-appointed attorney who'd represented me in my divorce proceedings. He'd quit his public defender work after my case, disillusioned by how easily the system could be corrupted. At the Foundation, he found new purpose directing our legal support program for whistleblowers. We rented office space in downtown Seattle, nothing extravagant, just functional space where we could do meaningful work. We built a team of investigators, attorneys, researchers, and advocates who believed that corporate accountability mattered more than comfort. I still think about room 22 at the Riverside Motel sometimes. About sitting on that sagging bed eating instant ramen with a plastic fork, wondering if I'd ever climb out of the hole my life had become. I keep the final receipt from my last week there in my wallet as a reminder that rock bottom is real, that humiliation and betrayal can strip away everything you thought defined you, but they can't actually destroy you unless you let them. Carmen had understood that. She'd spent her final years building a case and assembling resources because she believed truth mattered more than comfort and justice mattered more than safety. She'd been right. The paranoid and everyone dismissed had been the only one who understood how the world actually worked, who recognized that powerful people don't stop being corrupt just because you trust them or play by rules they ignore. 5 years after I found Carmen's package under that motel bed, I stood at the dedication ceremony for the Torres Vaughan Center for Pharmaceutical Ethics, a research facility and advocacy center we'd funded to train the next generation of ethical researchers and whistleblowers. The building stood on the Seattle waterfront with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Puget Sound. Inside, research labs and legal clinics operated side by side, creating a space where science and justice could work together instead of in opposition. My mother's photograph hung in the lobby alongside Carmen's, both women smiling in pictures taken years before they'd paid the ultimate price for believing that doing the right thing mattered more than staying safe. During my speech at the dedication, I talked about how betrayal had nearly destroyed me, but evidence and resources had given me the power to fight back. I talked about the importance of documentation, of believing people who raise uncomfortable concerns, of supporting whistleblowers even when their warnings seem paranoid or extreme. My Aunt Carmen spent years collecting evidence while everyone called her crazy. I told the audience of researchers, advocates, and survivors. My mother died trying to expose fraud that was killing people. They were right, and everyone who dismissed them was wrong. We built this center to make sure that the next person who discovers dangerous corporate misconduct doesn't face the same isolation and retaliation they did. After the ceremony, a young woman approached me, a research assistant who'd blown the whistle on data manipulation at her lab and been fired for it. She was facing lawsuits designed to bankrupt her and silence others who might consider speaking up. "Thank you," she said simply. "For fighting. For building this. For showing that it's possible to win." I gave her the foundation's card and told her we'd help with her legal defense, that she wouldn't have to face retaliation alone. That's why Carmen left me the evidence and resources. Not so I could disappear into comfortable obscurity, but so I could build systems that protect people who do the hard, dangerous work of telling the truth when powerful institutions want them silent. 5 years passed. I never remarried. Dating felt complicated after learning my entire marriage had been a surveillance operation. How do you trust romantic interest after discovering someone spent 7 years pretending to love you as a job? But I built meaningful friendships, real ones, based on honesty rather than strategic objectives. I reconnected with people from graduate school who'd known me before Derek, before the betrayal, before everything fell apart. I made new friends through the foundation who understood what it meant to fight powerful institutions and survive. Derek is currently serving his sentence at a federal correctional facility in Oregon. I've never visited, never written, never acknowledged his existence beyond the court proceedings that put him there. Lauren gets out in 3 years. She's written me several more letters, each one full of apologies I don't need and explanations I don't want. I don't respond because there's nothing left to say to someone who weaponized friendship. I think about forgiveness sometimes, whether holding on to anger makes me smaller or stronger, whether letting go would bring peace or just feel like betraying my mother and Carmen. I've decided that forgiveness isn't something I owe to people who systematically destroyed lives. Some betrayals are too calculated to forgive. Some people don't deserve the absolution they seek. And I'm okay with that. The Torres Vaughan Foundation operates in 12 states now, with a staff of 47 people and an annual budget of $8 million. We've helped expose fraud at 9 pharmaceutical companies, supported 63 whistleblowers facing retaliation, and contributed to safety reviews that prevented an estimated 200,000 patient injuries. Those numbers represent lives saved, families protected, people who didn't have to suffer because we created systems that valued truth over profit. That's Carmen's legacy. That's my mother's legacy. And now it's mine. I still live modestly despite having access to resources most people can't imagine. The apartment in Capitol Hill, the practical car, the simple wardrobe. I learned in room 22 at the Riverside Motel that material possessions are temporary and status is illusory. What matters is using whatever power you have to make the world slightly less corrupt than you found it. What matters is refusing to let powerful people erase you from the narrative they've constructed. What matters is fighting even when fighting seems impossible, documenting even when documentation seems paranoid, believing even when belief seems naive. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how things turned out, if I wish I'd never found Carmen's package, never discovered the truth, never fought back. The answer is always no. Yes, learning that my entire marriage was fabricated destroyed something fundamental in how I understood reality. Yes, losing everything before finding the resources to fight was traumatic in ways I'm still processing. Yes, some nights I still wake up angry about years stolen and trust betrayed. But I'm not the woman who lived in that motel room anymore, eating instant ramen and wondering if she'd ever matter again. I'm stronger than she was. More careful about trust, but also more certain about what matters. That woman didn't understand how much she could survive or how powerful she could become when everything else had been stripped away. I'm grateful I'm not her anymore. The greatest revenge isn't destruction, it's transformation. It's taking the worst thing that ever happened to you and using it to build something that prevents it from happening to others. It's refusing to let the people who tried to erase you have the final word. It's standing in a building you funded, looking at photographs of the women who gave you the tools to fight, and knowing that their deaths weren't meaningless because you made sure they sparked change. That's justice. That's redemption. That's what Carmen meant when she said she knew which choice would let me sleep at night. If this story of betrayal, justice, and redemption resonated with you, I'd love to hear which moment affected you most. Was it discovering the package in the motel? Learning the full extent of Derek's deception? Watching the trials unfold? Or seeing Rebecca build something meaningful from the ruins? The truth is, we all face betrayals, maybe not as dramatic as Rebecca's, but moments when people we trust reveal themselves to be something else entirely. What matters is what we do after the betrayal. Whether we let it destroy us or whether we use it as fuel to become something stronger. Rebecca chose to fight. Carmen and Isabel chose to fight. And because they did, hundreds of people are alive today who would have been harmed by pharmaceutical fraud. That's the power of refusing to be erased. That's the power of documentation and patience, and using whatever resources you have to hold powerful people accountable. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. May you never need to fight the kind of battle Rebecca fought, but if you do, may you have the courage and resources she did.